Hi, I'm Ed Stetzer, the Director of Lifeway Research, and I'm excited to be able to be with you and to share with you some of the principles we learned, and Mike Dodson and I, through writing Comeback Churches. We're going to talk today about some of the research that we gleaned from 324 churches from 10 denominations, from churches that had been in a transitional period of decline, maybe for 5 years or more. It's kind of our limit. And then they experienced rapid growth after that. They were revitalized. They were transformed. And what we did is we asked these churches, 324 of them, to tell us the things that they did. And the research basically is their story. It's what they did to see the transformation that took place in their churches. And then we're going to talk today about some of the principles we learned, but also the application that you can make in your local church. Because we really believe, Mike and I believe, is that God has chosen the church to make known His manifold wisdom in the world. That's a quote from Ephesians 3:10. So we know that the scriptural model is that churches see individuals and communities transformed by the power of the gospel. There are several categories that we began to see emerge that were trends or trends of practices or frequently done things that we'll talk about over this series. And 5 of them we're going to talk about here, kind of some factors that were risen to the surface that hopefully will be things you can think about, apply in your own local church context. And we're going to go through them. It's going to be visional leadership, intentional evangelism, lay mobilization, celebrative worship, and a renewed focus on Jesus and the mission of His church. Those are the 5 things we'll be walking through in this series together. We're going to start with the issue of leadership. And I must confess, when Mike and I wrote the book and did the research, we didn't really want leadership to be the most important thing. And part of the reason is that so much cliche is built around that. Everything rises and falls on leadership, and leaders, have to be there. And I guess we hoped that other factors were there. But the reality is very clearly the research showed us that visional leadership was essential to churches experiencing revitalization. The churches we surveyed were plateaued or stuck for at least 5 years, and then experienced evangelistic growth. They experienced a growth in attendance. They experienced several things that took place to make them qualify to be one of the 324 churches from 10 denominations in our study. But in the process of doing that, when we asked questions, we found that much of what took place because leaders led. This shouldn't surprise us. The Bible clearly says in 1 Timothy chapter 3 that if a man desires to be an overseer, is a noble thing. And I think sometimes we've become afraid of leadership in the church, and we ought not to be. Perhaps we've seen it abused, perhaps we've seen it misunderstood, but biblical leadership that casts vision is essential if your church is to be a comeback church, if your church is to experience that kind of revitalization. Leadership is not without cost. There's a price to be paid when you act out and speak out in leadership approaches. So we're going to talk some about visional leadership. We found, and I'm going to quote several things from the book as we go through, that leaders help churches to see that their real problems are spiritual. Some have said that the task of a leader is to define reality. Well, when it comes to the work of the local church, the realities are spiritual first and foremost before anything else. They're spiritual issues. And quoting from Leadership Journal here, we quoted in the book, it says, turnaround leaders distinguish between obvious symptoms and underlying problems. The first step is helping the congregation admit there's a problem. And that's hard because the reality is that most churches wish to continue to exist as things have always been, perhaps without making a change. And change is necessary. You cannot expect different results doing the same thing. So change is necessary, but change is difficult. And so wise leaders, and this is where you can apply this in your context, is wise leaders help their churches to understand current reality. And that reality is first and foremost spiritual. But there are other factors as well. There may be sociological realities about the community that have changed. There may be facility realities that you need to communicate to your congregation. One of the ways I've worked with churches to help them identify their reality is through resources like charts that might analyze the church for the last 20 years. Think about if your church has been declining for 15 years, standing up before the church with a chart and say, this is where we are, and then trending that out for the next 10 years. This is where we'll be if current trends continue. So again, you can help your church to understand that reality. Also, too, think about the realities of your community. Perhaps your community is transitioned. Of the churches I've had the privilege of leading through a revitalization process, one of them's community had deeply transitioned. The community was remarkably dissimilar from what it was 50 years earlier when the church was founded. It was remarkably dissimilar from the people who attended the church today. And so for me to stand up as I did and to say, here's who lives here, and here's the helpful part, here's who lives here, and then simultaneously, here's who lives here's who attends our church, and to see that they don't match really makes a great illustration and a great application for you to use in your context to help people define their reality. So it takes leadership to help people understand reality, but it also takes leadership to create an atmosphere of revitalization in a comeback church. You're going to do that through your preaching. You're going to do that through your teaching. Ultimately, if revitalization is going to come, it's not simply going to come because one day you as a leader or maybe a pastor or staff or key leader in the church got up and said, we're going to change. It's going to take a time of changing the climate, maybe ratcheting up the temperature a little bit so people have a burning passion for a community that's far from Christ. So what is leadership? I mean, leadership is when people are involved in helping others to influence them, to develop a direction to accomplish God's purpose, but doing so under the power of the Holy Spirit. And that's ultimately what you're called to do. Leadership is not something to be dismissed or to be ignored. Leadership is something to be exercised, and it must be in comeback churches. When we ask churches if strong leadership had a major effect on the comeback, please describe the leadership factors that affected the comeback. And here are some of the phrases that people use to describe some of the things we saw that were key issues in their responses. Things like being proactive and intentional. There was a proactivity that, and this is incredibly important to apply. It wasn't simply, I'll wait for the church to see the need for revitalization. No. Instead, it was, I'm going to proactively help us to define reality, and then I'm going to intentionally lead us. I was going to say force us. And I think sometimes we do have to force to face reality. But if people don't want to face reality, you can't force them. So ultimately, to lead us to understand reality and be intentional about how we're going to address our future. Sharing ministry is one that came up consistently. The idea here that it is necessary for us to give away ministry. Now, we say that, but we sort of function differently. Let's face it. If you're a pastor or a church leader, you get great affirmation when people say how important you are, how essential you are, how great you are to do this ministry, visit them, care for them, accomplish this agenda. And sometimes we have this relationship where we keep getting the affirmation and then saying, oh, I just wish you did more, but we keep taking that upon ourselves. Leaders don't just say you need to be involved. Leaders lead us to be involved and secondarily confront us when we are not. Changing attitude towards growth. There's a strange thing in the Christian world sometimes, is that sometimes what we think is that churches shouldn't grow. It's more spiritual, it's more holy, it's more pure if our church doesn't grow. And so what we do is instead we celebrate a church that is pure, but not focused on the mission of God, seeing individuals and communities transformed by the gospel. And my encouragement is to remember that what we celebrate, we become. And if as a leader, you're celebrating a mentality of, we just can't reach people, and so therefore we're just going to focus on us being better, I think ultimately we miss the focus of much of the Great Commission. We miss the focus of the Great Commandment as well, to love one another and to serve others and to tell them about the good news of Jesus Christ. So ultimately it comes to do with activating a shared vision. Now, most everyone in your church already has a vision. This is an important point. Most everyone in your church already has a vision. And it differs some degree from each other. It differs from your vision. All of us have different visions. And your vision is not the only vision that God's going to give to the church. It's going to be a sense that God's going to speak to the people of God and through the people of God to create a vision for the church. And when He does, your task is to help activate that, to help people live out the vision that God has given them. And to do that, you have to challenge them. You have to challenge them at the very level of, all right, if this is what God has spoken to us, if this is what we believe God wants us to do, we are going to now do that. And ultimately, that's not always the easiest thing to do. And one of the reasons we know it's not easy is the research. When we did the research, we found that about 60% of the leaders who helped to lead these churches to revitalization. Remember, our qualification was 5 years of plateau or decline, with then 2 to 5 years of growth through evangelism. Details you can find in the book, but in that process of leading the churches, that 60% of the churches that experienced revitalization did so when a new pastor came. And that can be a little challenging, a little disturbing even, but we have to remember that about 40% had the same pastor. So what changed? Well, we asked the pastors that, and they shared stories upon stories with us that they changed. Ultimately, churches have to change and leaders have to change. If you are on this journey and the church is not reaching its community and doesn't see a turnaround in sight, the answer has got to be you leading. Now I say you, and I mean that in the sense of you as pastor, you as church leaders, but the church leadership together saying we're going to activate and live in this shared vision. So it's shared vision, it's shared ministry. Visional leadership is about sharing. It's about people getting it, joining on board, and the more people you get on board, the more essential that it is. Because you remember, when people are rowing the boat, they have a lot less time to be rocking the boat, and there are going to be significant numbers of people in any church going through change that have people who resist that change. Now, mind you, keep in mind that disagreeing with you is not the same as disagreeing with God. That having a different vision is not the same as being disobedient to God's plan. We have to listen and kind of learn on the journey. But in every church, there are people who simply are going to say, I don't want to be the kind of church that God could use in this community. So ultimately, that's part of the challenge that you'll experience is how do you get a church together to have that sense of shared vision and to press forward together. Well, let me share some things that may help with that, some practical things about how they shared ministry. For example, comeback leaders quickly gave away non-ministry tasks. If it's not related to the core function of that God has called you to do as a pastor, as a church leader, give it away to somebody else. If not, your time will be accumulated, filled with things that don't advance the cause and the mission of the church. Leaders and attitudes. Here's another one. Comeback leaders made choices about those in whom they invested their time and how they invested their time. You know, it's funny how we'll spend all this time in business meetings voting and discussing budget. And they're essential. It's good things to do. But ultimately, we never talk about how we budget our time. If you want to know, here's very practical, very applicable. If you want to know whether or not you're investing in leaders, look at your time budget this past week. And if you're a pastor or if you're a leader and you're not investing in other leaders with a significant portion of your time, you're not raising up others who'll share the vision and the values to move forward in visional leadership. Also, there's a process of intentional planning. Very, very practically here, comeback leaders intentionally use their time and the time of others differently than they did before. They spent more time on the people stuff, and they intentionally strategized to reorder their own priorities and to cast a compelling vision. Let's talk about that vision for a little bit. Comeback leaders agreed that having a clear and compelling vision was foundational in the transformation of their churches. It was a foundational issue. This is not something to the side. Now, I recognize that most of us are not natural-born leaders. I'm not a natural-born leader. I'm not a natural-born vision caster. And I had to learn this from a lot of different places. But ultimately, people follow vision because they're interested in committing to something worthwhile. Part of my concern is that we have created in our churches a tame version of the faith with a tame church that doesn't require a lot worth giving our lives to. Well, ultimately, vision comes from faith. And vision comes from faith and allows the church to be or to do something beyond its current abilities to impact the kingdom. I have to cast a vision, something bigger than myself, something that's going to live on after I die, and something that's worth committing my life to, and then calling others to commit their lives to. And let's be blunt, church as usual is just not that compelling of a vision. The usual, what we have created in American church, just isn't that compelling. So we've got to cast a vision for something different. And how do we do that? How do we share that vision? Well, one of the things is a vision has to be credible. If you come through some of our training and you kind of say, well, I want to be a comeback church, and I'm running 50 people, and I'm going to go back to my church and say, by the end of the year, we're going to be running 400 people. Well, that's not a credible vision. People, not only will people not respond, but oftentimes what they'll do is they'll consider that a pipe dream rather than a vision. But credible vision casters are able to explain both in speech, the way when you talk about it, and in writing, what a different future looks like, a future more shaped by God's plans, God's agenda, and a church that's transforming this community. Here's some very practical things. Sit down and write down, where is God leading your church? Don't write down the values. We want to be a church that does so and so. I mean, that's essential, and that's going to be part of it. But when you're casting a vision, tell me what it looks like. I want to see it in my head. I want you to persuade the persuadable. I want people in your church to say, that's worth committing my life to. Now, it's got to be credible. If you've been pastoring the same church for 15 years, and during those 15 years it has declined by 3% per year, for you to go up next year and say, we're going to grow by 100%, it's not credible. But for you to get up and say, we're going to reverse that, here's how we're going to reverse it, and here's what it looks like when that's reversed, when we're refocused on the mission and the purpose of God. So be honest with people. Explain the risks. Here are the dangers of us doing that. Some people are going to be mad. If your church is growing, growing churches have problems. Growing churches have problems with facilities. They have problems with parking. They have problems that people got to be moved around. You're going to have problems with a growing church. Now, you have problems with a non-growing church, too. I'd rather have the ones of a growing church that's reaching its people. So, again, explain the risks, count the costs, keep the vision before the people. I found that I would monthly communicate the vision, kind of a visual picture, a clear mental image of where we're going as a church on a monthly basis to make sure people understood where it was that we were heading. One writer talk says that vision leaks. And so we sometimes think that if we talk about it once a year, maybe a vision Sunday, that's it. No. You don't preach a whole sermon on it once a month, but communicating it once a month is a very practical way to continue to say, here, we agreed on this vision. We're all working towards this vision. I'm just reminding you of that vision. So that leadership matters. And what happens when you have visional leadership is you begin to multiply yourself. Now, this is a key issue, is that most of us aren't accustomed to multiplying leaders. As leaders, we're often accustomed to making more followers, and that makes it dependent upon us. The whole system becomes dependent upon us. So what we've got to do is find people who will buy into the vision. And people aren't going to buy into the vision until really they buy into you. They're going to have to look to you and say, I see this person as credible, as godly, this is a spiritual issue, as leading us in the right direction, as having listened to us as a congregation, and therefore they then buy into you. And then you can begin to develop those leaders accordingly. You begin to help them to multiply. Now let's talk about that multiplication thing. One of the issues of visional leadership is helping to really give people a sense of the value of multiplication. Ultimately, one of the challenges of the American churches is we have created a model, a system that causes everything to rely on a leader with a bunch of followers. And churches that look like that never break out of destructive cycles. They're both destructive cycles for the church and for the pastor. But we found that churches that are led by leaders who are helping to break through those cycles are led by leaders who multiply themselves. And that's a key issue. In other words, I'm raising up. And here's a very practical question for you. If you're a pastor or if you're a church leader, is do you have several people that you are investing your life in today so that they are becoming more effective leaders? This is just right in Scripture. You know, the things you've heard from me in the presence of faithful men, entrust these to others who'll be able to teach others also. Paul's admonition to Timothy. And so we know that multi-generational faithful men who'll be able to teach others also, you know, we know that multi-generational approach is essential in the church, and yet we don't often budget the time for it. Visional leadership creates a new vision for people to follow. One of the world's best-known philosophers is Ivan Illich. And Ivan Illich once wrote, he was once asked, how do you create change in an organization? Do you do it through revolution? Do you start over, tear it down, you know, just start over from scratch? Or do you do it through incremental change? Do you do it through changing things little by little? And he said neither. He said neither. What you do is you tell an alternative story. You help people to see something different. And I'd encourage you in your ministry and that your church would tell an alternative story that's grounded in Scripture, that's birthed from a deep, abiding relationship with the Spirit of God, and that really causes people to commit to that alternative story. That's visional leadership. That's ultimately how we live out visional leadership in our context. I told you earlier that 40% were pastors who were the same pastor before and same pastor after the transformation. I'm guessing that's many of you right here in listening today. Your desire is to be that kind of leader. Well, you can be. I mean, remember that 40% were, and they told us stories about how God changed them, how God changed their leadership, but those were always built around creating a team of people with a common vision and a common mission, causing people to buy in to something that was worth giving their lives to. Well, if, as we started, if Ephesians 3:10 really says that God has chosen the church to make known His manifold wisdom in the world, we need a less tame church. We need a church that's worth committing our lives to because it's bought into a mission worth committing our lives to, and that ultimately is something that's worth leading people to. A lot of spiritual factors here. We're going to get to those. A lot of spiritual factors here, but visional leadership requires leaders who will lead people to those spiritual agendas so that the name and fame of Jesus would be more widely known. So, visional leadership. We're going to take it through visional leadership. The next time we're together, we're going to talk about the issue of intentional evangelism. You can have a great vision, but if that vision doesn't involve men and women hearing the good news of Jesus Christ and being transformed by the gospel, it's not a vision that lines up with the vision of Jesus, who came to seek and save those who were lost. So next time, we'll talk more about intentional evangelism.